So one more time, this is Jess Murphy, NAWIC National PD&E Chair. This is the AIA Construction Form Update online webinar from the PD&E Committee. It's being given by Attorney David Fine of Myrick O'Connell. This program is being recorded and will be archived on nawic.org under the Member Center, as well as on NAWIC's YouTube channel. If you don't wish to be recorded and have your comments, any that are typed in, be recorded as well, please exit the call now. For those staying on, I appreciate you joining us today. It will be a full seminar. Dave has indicated there's quite a bit of information. Our presenter today is Attorney David Fine of Myrick O'Connell. I had the fortunate opportunity to go to school with Dave. Both of us graduated from Suffolk Law School and about 12 years ago. Dave left law school and started practicing in Rhode Island. He worked with one of the firms who literally wrote the book on the mechanics lien law in Rhode Island. A number of years ago, Dave moved back to Massachusetts and joined me at Myrick O'Connell, which operates in Westboro and Worcester, Massachusetts. Dave formalized our construction group, and the two of us have been doing construction litigation, contracts, and dispute work for the past 12 years. Dave is very active with the AIA and a number of industry groups in the construction field. He's got a wealth of experience on the changes to the forms and how the forms are used in practice. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over, as long as I can, to Dave Fine. And he'll go ahead at the end of the presentation. We'll take questions. If you can type them into the text box, we'll read them aloud. Most of the participants will be muted, so the best way to contact anybody here will be by using the text box. So Dave, I'm clicking over to you now. You should see this momentarily.
This program is called the 2017 AIA Documents, What Changed? As most of you know, this past year, about 3 or 4 months ago, the AIA released a set of new documents. What folks are saying about these new documents, to begin with, is that they are evolutionary, not revolutionary. That's the tagline. That's the tagline that the AIA has provided. There are still changes you need to know about. There are several terms that shift risk, that affect rights, obligations, and so on and so forth.
Hi, everybody. Sorry for the confusion there. I think you should be able to hear me now, and I just needed to mute the background. So, Dave, can you unmute yourself and continue with the presentation? All right, so I apologize for the technical difficulties. Dave, if you go to the button, yes, go down to the attendee list button, which has the 192 number on it, and click on that. If you find yourself, you should be able to unmute yourself, and you can do a search in the middle and find both yourself there and possibly the phone number. I apologize, everybody, for the confusion on this one. This is my first time doing the presentation hosting duties. I'm going to go ahead and unmute.
Okay,
Dave,
can everyone hear me at this point?
Yes, we
yeah,
can.
I apologize, Dave. I just unmuted
Okay.
everybody. So hopefully
Okay.
we'll have you continue.
That's great, Jess. Thank you very much. And I will continue now. I'm going to get the, I'll just start from the beginning and I'll fly through the first couple of slides in case anybody missed the opening few slides. So as I was mentioning, the AIA documents change every 10 years. The 2017 round was the most recent. The AIA, per their own literature, reached out to several industry groups in reviewing and making the determinations which changes were to be made. The groups, some of those groups are listed here. Notably, there has been some backlash from the industry that owners groups were not were not approached, and as a result, there's been at least a perceived anti-owner slant in this most recent round of changes. So these 2017 changes only address the core design bid build documents. That's the A201 general conditions, the 101 owner agreement, the 401 subcontractor agreement, and the B101 architect agreement. Now, these changes do not address the design build documents, do not address the construction management agreements. Those changes will be coming down the road in the next 5 years in the case of the CM agreements, 3 years in the case of the CM agreements, and 2024 in the case of the design build agreements. So I'll dive right in. There are plenty of changes. In fact, there were hundreds of changes made to these core documents. And what I'm going to do is address the 10 to 15 of the most important changes in each of these documents. I'll start with the A201 general conditions. And the first change I'm going to talk about is a change to the notice requirements. The notice was always defined in the A201. What the change here did was that it made notice by electronic means now permitted under the contract. So notice by email is now permitted in most every circumstance within the contract docs. The one exception to that is notice of claims. If you have a claim, still require notice by certified mail or by courier. But all other notice, whether it's notice of differing conditions, changes, safety concerns, submittals, termination, what have you, now can be accomplished by electronic means. Some changes to the BIM protocols and digital protocol requirements. There was always a basic requirement for BIM that's been around for some time. It's taken off tremendously, as you all know, within the last 10 years, or maybe even longer. Now BIM is required. There's actually a new E203 exhibit, which requires the party to the contract to adopt protocols before the contract is signed or at the time of signing for digital data. And what this does is it shifts risk so that if the data protocols are not adopted, then the risk is going to be on the party relying on those protocols as the project goes forward, as opposed to if there are protocols agreed to and created per this exhibit, then the risk is going to be on the party creating that exhibit, whoever came up with those protocols to begin with. The next change is in the 201. This is a big one, evidence of financial arrangements. Before, there was always this provision did pre-exist in the 201. The contractor, the language was that the contractor may request. The contractor had the ability to request financial evidence of the owner's financial arrangements for the work, either before the project or at certain intervals during the project. For example, if the owner failed to make payments, if there was a reasonable concern, or if there were material changes. So what this change does is it actually creates an affirmative obligation on the part of the owner. The owner shall furnish evidence of financial arrangements to the contractor before the work begins. In fact, the contractor has no obligation to start until that information is furnished. And similarly, during the project now, at those same intervals, the owner is now obligated to provide evidence of financial information or arrangements within 14 days, or the contractor can immediately stop work. And that kind of language gives owners heartburn. Anything that allows the contractor to stop work is problematic from an owner's perspective. But so this is being met with applause by the on the contractor side, as it gives much more teeth to the requirement. The next change has to do with the owner's right to carry out work in Section 2.5 of the 201. This is on the contractor's default. The old procedure was that a deduct change order was issued. This was inconsistent with the definition of a change order, which by its own definition was an agreement between the owner and the contractor to an adjustment. And here, clearly, if there's been a default by the contractor, there is no agreement. So now what it does is it says the architect can simply withhold the cost of the takeover. This change to 3.3.1 has to do with unsafe means and methods. Before, in the 2007 version, if the contractor became aware of anything unsafe, it was to notify the architect and wait for instruction. Now there's a bit of a change there. The language here calls for the contractor to actually propose alternative methods to get around the unsafe condition. And really what this does is it recognizes that the contractor is in the best position to know what is safe. And if you look at the language at the end of this provision, the owner is only responsible if its architect overrules the contractor's proposed alternative, which again is common sense. Change to 3.5.2, this has to do with warranties, special warranties, and really this change just catches up to the reality that all material and equipment warranties are going to be turned over to the owner. They're meant to be in favor of the owner and to be owned by the owner at the end of the day, and so this language catches up with that reality. Differing site conditions change now from a 21-day window to provide notice. Contractor now is 14 days. And really that's just industry participants telling the AIA that 21 days was unnecessary. Schedule requirements, still now in the 201. The contractor's schedule is still soft, still not quite to the level of a critical path method, but the contractor now does have to identify a little bit more detail in the schedule that it initially provides to the owner, identifying some dates of work, so on and so forth. Again, from an owner's perspective, owners are probably requiring a little bit more detail in any event, along the lines of a CPM type schedule, particularly institutional owners. Communications between parties. The A201 made a change. Historically, the architect was placed at the epicenter of all communications. Basically, everything had to go through the architect as between the owner and the contractor. What this version does is it recognizes that there are certainly circumstances where the architect is not involved and really shouldn't be involved, and the owner and contractor should communicate directly. So this requirement, may be largely ignored previously, is now caught up to the times and acknowledged that there are times when the owner and contractor need to communicate directly. 9.6.8 concerns indemnity for liens. This is a provision contractors in the audience know well that owners have been requiring for some time. It's been a noticeable absentee from the AIA documents, and that is if there are any mechanics liens that are filed as a result of your work, then you're going to be responsible to indemnify the owner for them. And this provision basically adopts the language that most owners were insisting on in any event in the 2007 and earlier iterations of the docs. Insurance, this is a big one. One of the biggest changes to the core set of documents is that Article 11, which covers all of the insurance requirements in the A201 has been largely gutted and moved to a separate exhibit. So really what this change was it was made in recognition of a need to be more flexible with insurance requirements, that there are several, that there are different projects, different needs, et cetera. And what the exhibit does is it allows the parties to take a separate piece of paper, give that to their agent, give it to their broker, circulate it among the parties, and arrive at what the insurance agreements are for a given project. There are still some substantive terms in the Article 11, which you can see up there, having to do with what the contractor is obligated to buy and maintain, some surety language, but largely the Article 11 has been gutted. New in the A201 is notice of requirement now. If the owner is going to if there's a cancellation or a lapse in the owner's property insurance, then the owner now needs to give notice of this to the contractor. So this is a good change for the contractors. This is some of the language that's now been reinserted back into what is really a gutted Article 11. And what this does is it allows, if there is a lapse in property insurance, in the owner's property insurance for a given project, then the contractor is entitled to stop work, receive an adjustment, and actually gets a release from claims that would have been covered had there been property insurance. So this is really a good change that was advocated for by several contractor groups. Profit. And what profit entitlement there is in the event of a termination. Here's a change to 14.1.3. If the owner breaches, i.e. if the owner fails to make payment, before the contractor was entitled to all of the value of the work performed. So you'd get the cost and reasonable profit on work performed. Now, a good change for the contractor. You get, in the event of an owner's breach, profit on not only the work you've performed, but also on the work not yet executed, which is obviously an important distinction. Now, here's a big change. In the event of a term for convenience, the old version, this is an owner's term for convenience, the old version, the 2007 version, called for the contractor to be entitlement to reasonable costs, for work performed, obviously, but also for overhead and profit on the work not yet executed, which, as contractors are well aware, a lot of the profit margin is buried into the last 15-20% of a project, and so that was an important coup for them, that language. But what wound up happening more often than not was that the owner would simply strike that line, and so that the overhead and profit on work not yet executed was simply read out of the contract. So here, what the AIA has done is they've shifted this, and they've created a fill box in the 101, which I'll get to, with this term termination fee. And what the AIA is asking the parties to do now is at the front end, as they're entering into the contract, to actually get together and come up with what a reasonable termination fee would be in the event of a termination, for convenience, right? If there's breach, all bets are off, but in the event of a term for convenience, the parties are now asked to come up with a term fee and put that into the A101 document. So the thinking here is that this is a big win for the owner because you've eliminated that language that entitled the contractor to overhead and profit on work not yet executed. But the thought here is that this really is not the win it's thought to be for the owner, because in the normal course, previously the owner would strike that language, and you'd kind of go about your business with your negotiating on the other terms. But here, this now creates an area where everybody stops, pauses, and actually comes up pre-contract with what a reasonable termination fee would be. Moving on, 15.1.3.1, still within the A201 now. This resolved a conflict in in appellate decisions, whether a claim submitted after substantial completion or final completion still had to be submitted to the initial decision maker, normally the architect. Now what the AIA has done is they've clarified that if the claim was discovered prior to the correction period, the 1-year correction period, and 12.2.2, then yes, that claim still does need to be submitted to the IDM. So now we're going to move on to the A101. Again, the owner-contractor agreement, moving off of the A201 general conditions. The first change here is really just a format change. There's now a checkbox for the date of commencement, and if you see there at the bottom of the screen, the default is the date of the agreement. So if you're a contractor and you're concerned that the date of commencement be adjusted and moved in line with issuance of permits or some other event, you need to be aware that the default is now the date of the agreement. And there's also a new section in there for substantial completion where the work is being phased, which I think will be helpful. Subtle change to the liquidated damage clause. It still prompts the parties to enter in whether there'll be liquidated damages for a given contract and project, but this has now been moved up in the A101, and so it's more visible and present, and it prompts the parties to consider it in advance. There's also, importantly, from the contractor's perspective, a fill point now for bonuses on early completion, which, as many of you know, are oftentimes a good quid pro quo when you're trying to negotiate a liquidated damage clause with an owner. If you ask for an early completion bonus, that sometimes levels the playing field. Progress payments, the procedure for progress payments was revised in this version of the AIA in section 5.1.6. It was really simplified. The language now is just the progress payment is the portion of the sum that's allocable to the completed work, which it makes sense, but it eliminates what was deleted was this sort of cumbersome language about the metric of how you arrive at each progress payment. This new language also clarifies the amounts that the architect and owner can reduce or offset each progress payment, and retainage now gets its own section. This is in 7.1.1, the termination fee that I was referencing and talking about in connection with the general conditions. Here's where it's located. This is where the drop box is. It's in 7.1.1 of the A101 for the parties to enter the termination fee. And then we move to the insurance exhibit. So the, as mentioned previously, Article 11 of the general conditions was more or less gutted, and all of these terms were now moved to a separate exhibit. I recommend that all of you get your hands on it and review it. It's got a lot in there. It's got a lot of change in there from what was previously in Article 11. I'll go over some elements of those now. So the next several slides are going to concern this insurance exhibit. One of the biggest changes is that there's a lot more language covering and addressing the requirements for builder's risk or all risk coverage. And there's much more detail in terms of what can and cannot be in that coverage. So for example, if you look at the language here, there can be no exclusion for fire, explosion, theft, vandalism, malicious mischief, etc. And these are often the types of risks that can be excluded depending on how the builder's risk policy is put together. So it's now incumbent on the either the agent or the folks within the company responsible for insurance risk to make sure that the builder's risk coverage is going to comply when they're working within the rubric of this insurance exhibit. Also, the new language now calls for either the owner or the contractor. Either may purchase the builder's risk. In the prior 2007 version, it called for the owner to purchase the builder's risk policy, but in reality, what had been happening over the last 7 to 8, 9 years is that a lot of the more sophisticated contractors were carrying it as a matter of course in their portfolio and would just add it to their cost of the contract, and all that language would have to be revised in order to accommodate the fact that the contractor was purchasing the property, the specialty property insurance. A change here, just to clarify, in the provision you see up on the screen regarding deductibles and self-insured retentions, that really, in reality, this was always the case anyway. The owner is going to be responsible, or whoever purchases, the property insurance is going to be responsible for those costs. Something to note here, again, sticking with the property insurance requirements, is that when you're dealing with a project that is an alteration or an addition to an existing structure, we have to make sure now that the existing structure is covered within the property insurance. Again, sometimes this is excluded, so something else to be concerned with, and make sure that your property insurance, if you are contractually responsible for purchasing it, that it covers the existing structure as well. So in addition to property insurance, now there are check boxes for other insurance to be purchased by the owner, and you can see the list here. Food for thought, loss of use, business interruption. Most owners, at least on the sophisticated commercial or industrial side, would have this type of protection in their portfolio, but it's a good checkbox as a contractor to refer to when you're going through your risk management exercises pre-contract. Time limits for contractors' insurance coverage. This clarifies the time the contractor has to maintain its insurance on the project. So what it does is it says it's insurance purchased by the contractor must be maintained through the 1-year correction period. Now, of course, a lot of owners are going to require completed operations coverage in any event, but notwithstanding this, the purpose of this change was to clarify how long the contractor has to have insurance in place. This is an important one. This is new. The contractor's general liability policy, now there's a specific list of 11 items that cannot, or risks that cannot be excluded in your general liability policy. Now, this is very important. Recommendation here is to not ignore this list. This is not just boilerplate. Policies that do not contain these exclusions can be hard to find. Some of these are rare, but some are pretty common in a general liability policy. And so you may have to tweak what your portfolio or how your portfolio reads in order to meet these requirements. These are exclusions that cannot or can no longer be in your general liability policy if you sign an unrevised 2017 document with this insurance exhibit. Some new contractor insurance requirements. Again, getting more detailed than the Article 11 insurance language contained prior to 2017. One thing to note here is that about halfway down the page, subsection A328, 3.2.8, if a contractor is going to be furnishing professional services as part of the work, the contractor now shall procure E&O coverage, professional liability coverage. This is going to be particularly important for those of you that perform CM type work, where you're getting involved pre-con, or you do any kind of design assist type work as a sub-trade or whatever the case may be. If you're doing anything that could be considered design or design assist, you probably should have already, but now you're going to be contractually required to purchase professional liability coverage, which obviously could affect the bottom line and changes the structure of what is commonly deemed to be insurance requirements on the contracting side as opposed to the design side. All right, now we're going to move on to the A401, which is the subcontractor-contractor agreement. And we're going to start out with the doozy. This one's a big change. This is a new term, section 3.3.5. And if you read it, it says the contractor shall promptly notify the subcontractor of any fault or defect in the work under this subcontract or a nonconformity with the subcontract docs. So this is a new obligation for a general contractor or a construction manager if the A401 is being used with the CM documents. So if the general contractor is now obligated contractually to give notice if there are any construction defects with the sub's work. And this is a new risk for the general contractor. Obviously, it was well-intentioned, and it was meant to provide for earlier notice of any defects. But really what it does is it opens up the contractor to liability. If they don't notify the sub and there ultimately is a defect, then the sub is now going to have an ability to allege breach, or at a minimum, a defense, that it was not aware of the defect, the contractor was, and therefore it has no responsibility. So this one, stay tuned, but could be a big shift in the risk element for construction defects. New requirement that subcontractor is now contractually entitled to receive a copy of a payment bond. Again, oftentimes this was requested and received in any event, but now there's a contractual requirement to furnish the bond. Subtle difference to the liquidated damage clause in the A401. Before, in the 2007 and earlier documents, if the contractor wanted to hold a subcontractor responsible for liquidated damages, it did so to the extent the sub caused the delay, and then there was a call to insert an amount into that subcontract, and that created some conflict between what was in the prime contract and what was in the subcontractor, some confusion on the part of the parties. So what the AIA has done now is that there is no longer a requirement to insert an amount. It's just a vanilla pass-through obligation that automatically incorporates, if there are LDs in the prime contract, that is automatically going to be incorporated into the subcontract. Something to be cognizant of, particularly if you're doing a lot of subcontracting and you're faced with this 2017 document. This is a new requirement now, again, staying with the 401 for subcontractor submittals. This is a representation now by the subcontractor that it's reviewed, approved, and confirmed all of its submittals. And what this will do is it opens up a new basis for a breach claim by a contractor. If you're a sub and your work doesn't comply with your submittal, the contractor now can allege that you have not complied with this contract term, you have not, in some context, reviewed or approved your own submittal, determined or verified materials, etc. So something to keep an eye on. Increases the obligation for submittals, the volume of the obligation for subcontractors. Subcontractors' protection of work. This is really just a clarification in what's now 4.2.7. The sub has to protect its own work and the work of the contractor or separate contractors around it. Again, common sense, but now reduced to writing in the new 401. The special warranties in 4.6.2, similar to the A201, put to writing what was already done in practice, that all material and equipment warranties are going to be in the name of the owner, are intended for the owner, and so forth. New language here, meant to protect a subcontractor doing design assist or any kind of design consulting work. This language is going to help that subcontractor. It's for that subcontractor's benefit. Essentially before, if in the 2007 docs and prior, if the subcontractor was going to engage in any kind of design assist work, it had to actually approach the general contractor and try to negotiate in language along these lines. That it's going to receive all the information it needs to receive in order to provide these services, that the services will be provided by somebody who's licensed, and that the sub is entitled to rely on all the information and criteria that it's provided. Now, by contract, the sub gets theoretically receives this information and is entitled to rely on it, and that's a good thing for the subcontractor. Termination by subcontractor. This clarifies an ambiguity that existed in the prior docs. Now, if the GC, if the contractor breaches, the subcontractor gets overhead and profit on work not yet executed. Again, that's consistent with, or not consistent with, but similar to other changes in other areas of these core docs. Clearly a fixation on this idea of whether in the case of a termination, whether it's on the contractor or subcontractor level, who gets OH&P, overhead and profit on work not yet executed, and when and why. Progress payments in the A401, similar to the A101, this new language simply is an attempt to streamline the progress payment process and procedure, so that every progress payment is really just a value paid for the allocable work completed. New language in the the A401, much more broad retainage provision than what previously existed. Before, the contractor could only retain to the extent that the owner retained. Now there's much more flexibility in the A401. It allows the parties to agree separately on what the retainage may be as between the contractor and subcontractor, and does not automatically tie that amount to what's in the prime contract. As a practical matter, from a general contractor standpoint or a CM standpoint, you may very well want to tie that amount to what is in the prime contract, but now this language gives both sides the flexibility to negotiate there. Similarly, the indemnity for liens that was carried in the A201 for contractors now applies also to subcontractors. If you as a sub, if your actions or the actions of someone under you cause a lien to be filed, you're now going to be obligated to indemnify and take action to defend against that lien. Insurance deductibles, this is new. The contractor now has, by contract, we'll strike that, the subcontractor now has an affirmative obligation to provide deductible and self-insured retention information to the contractor. And the point here is that it helps the general contractor, the prime contractor, understand what its exposure may be. Not a major change, but one to note. Notice requirements in the 401 meant to mirror those in the 201. Again, emails and electronic notice is now permissible in most circumstances, but not in the event of a claim. A claim still must be by certified mail or courier. It's worth noting that here and in the A201, the contract has to be clear as to the manner of electronic notice. So it behooves everybody to include email addresses or other electronic information to identify exactly what is that appropriate and contractually authorized manner that the parties can communicate electronically. Moving on now to the last of the 4 core documents that are addressed in these 2017 changes. The B101, that is the owner-architect agreement. What the first change here is that most of you, if you operate in this area, know there was a separate document called the initial information, Exhibit A, that used to dovetail with the B101. That's been deleted. That's been eliminated, and the reason being is that a lot of that information was really just duplicative. It just identified the names of the parties and some of the other really basic information, and all of that is captured in the agreement in any event. Similar to the A201, before these changes, digital data protocols were followed, but really optional. Now the parties, including the architect, are required to agree on some level as to some protocol per the E203 exhibit, which offers a level of protection for all of those on the all the parties on the project performing the work that are relying on that protocol. Not a controversial change here. In 2.1, there's an added requirement now that the architect represents that's licensed where it's doing the work, and most owners, I hope, would have added that language anyway, going back a number of years. You don't want an unlicensed design team. Again, 3.1.4, not a controversial provision. Basically, if the owner accepts work, then the architect's not going to be responsible for it, even if it's non-conforming, which is common sense. In 3.5, the language, the nomenclature has been changed, so that what used to be the bidding or negotiation phase of the services, the basic services to be provided by the architect, has been changed now. It's called the procurement phase services. And if you move down about halfway down the page to the section 3.5.2.3, the architect's review of substitutions is now going to be included as an additional service. And this will be a common theme you'll see throughout the next few slides, that really a lot of these changes are aimed either directly or impliedly at resulting in more compensation for the architect. Supplemental services versus additional services. There is a change in the B101 now. Used to be, prior to 2017, that there were two types of services essentially in for the architect. Basic services, which was reviewing the criteria, developing a design, coming up with contract documents, and then perhaps overseeing the administration of the project. And then there was a whole panoply of additional services that were listed that the architect could buy onto and be compensated on an hourly basis. Now what the AIA has done is they've created a third type of service. So you've got your basic services still. Now you've got most of what used to be additional service are now called supplemental service. So at the time of contracting, the parties can agree that the architect's going to be responsible for any one of these responsibilities in the list here, these obligations in the list, and they're going to be called supplemental services. To the extent that the owner and architect agree on other services on a going forward basis, those are going to be called additional services. So there's a distinction now in the AIA basic architect agreement between these supplemental services, which are agreed to at the time of contracting, and additional services, which may be agreed to after the contract is signed. And again here, continuation, really the same thought, supplemental versus additional services, more language on that idea. One thing to note here is in the new language there in 4.2.4 is that any services that are undertaken more than 60 days after substantial completion, now by contract definition, those will be additional services and charged accordingly. So it puts a temporal limit on and creates a finite line whereby after that line you're going to pay the architect on an hourly basis. Communications, again, this is consistent with the change in the A201, recognizing and acknowledging that there are circumstances where the architect isn't and shouldn't be involved in communications, and allows the owner and contractor to communicate. Subtle change to the definition of the cost of the work. The cost of the work when the architect is putting this together pre-project now includes owner-furnished work, which really gets at estimating services. So this is the AIA's attempt to capture estimating services within the cost of the work. And what that really does is by increasing across the board what will be the cost of the work and how that term is defined, that's going to influence and increase the architect's fee, because the architect's fee is going to be commensurate as a percentage with the cost of the work. So that's the ultimate result here. When the estimates come in high, when the bids come in high based on what the previous estimates were, this one could be controversial, and it's worth noting on the owner architect side. So new revisions to section 6.7. Before, if the bids exceeded what, the original budget, the owner had options. There were a few different options listed in there that you could go back to the architect, ask for revisions, among other things. Now, the architect's going to be paid an additional fee if it turns out that the bids were over due to market conditions. And you see that term there about halfway down this section 6.7. Well, that's going to likely, in this opinion anyway, create some question as to what is the root cause of the budget having been busted, right? So was it due to market conditions? What does market conditions mean? Which market conditions? And there may be some fighting there between the owner and architect as to whether the architect's got to go back to the drawing board on its own dime, or whether it's going to be entitled to be paid extra when the bids come in high. Terminating for convenience, terminating the architect for convenience is going to be consistent now with the changes in the A201. There's a call here for a termination fee, and you'll notice also a licensing fee if the owner intends to use the architect's documents for the parties to sit down at the front end and actually negotiate what those fees are going to be. And just a point of clarification, the new Section 9.8 states that the agreement terminates on its own 1 year from the date of substantial completion. This was meant really as a point of clarification because there were questions as projects would linger and completion, closeout process procedures would linger, and then there was dispute between the owner and architect when the contract actually terminated, how they were to be compensated, and on what basis, and this helps clarify that point. No major change to the progress payment for the architect, although there are now fill points. So you have to determine whether the architect's going to be paid by a fixed price, stipulated sum, or on a percentage basis as a percentage of the cost of the work. Those are the list of the 10 to 15 changes in the core documents that came down in the last 3 to 4 months. The parties, there's some other changes as well. For example, there's a new exhibit now, the E204. The parties can have the option to sign this exhibit. It really applies to all of the core documents. In fact, I think all of the AIA documents. And if the parties wish to go down the road of making the project sustainable, the exhibit lays out in great detail what the agreements, room for the parties to insert what their agreements are and how they're going about achieving those sustainable results. Some other changes listed here, moving on down the list, the A105 short form, A104, some of these have been renamed, so the 107 short form is now going to be the 104. There's no longer an A107, among other changes. Really just form. Some of the changes are notable for what they do not include. For example, there is still now a long process for termination of a contractor. That was a controversial area and one that was discussed and looked at. Really, based on how the terms read still, a contractor basically works for free for 60 to 70 days after the notices come in. Or after the process is initiated, because notice has to be furnished, and then there has to be several occurrences that take place before the contract is actually before the contractor leaves. So there was thought that this was going to be addressed, but it turns out those were left alone. The IDM, there was a thought about removing it altogether. This is the decision maker that typically is, any claim typically has to go first to the IDM under the AIA scheme, and that normally, unless it's revised, is the architect. There was discussion about whether to remove that altogether as being overly cumbersome, but in the end they decided to leave it. And then lastly, there has been a call for some time about reciprocal indemnification. The fact that there's no owner-side indemnity protection for a contractor in any of these agreements still does not exist. So no downstream indemnity in these new documents. As I mentioned at the beginning, preview of coming attractions, the CM at risk documents, the A133, that document right now is a 2009, and so in keeping with their every 10 years, the new docs will come out in 2019. And the design build documents, we're still a ways away, although 2024 will probably be upon us before we know it. Those are coming down the road because the operative documents now are 2014. So that's all I have. I'm going to attempt now to turn this back over to Jessica. And in fact, why don't I, if I can navigate now, some of these questions, I can take a look. What I'll do is I'll turn it over, and if you all have in front of you the ability to insert message, you can ask questions through that process.
Hi, everybody. It's Jess Murphy. I apologize for the delay. I had trouble disconnecting and hopefully logging back on. If anyone could just drop me a chat to let me know that they could hear me, I'd appreciate it. All right. So great. I just wanted to let you guys know, hopefully I'm sharing my screen right now that just says thanks for attending our online seminar. Just on behalf of the PDE committee, I know it's hard to take an hour away. Hopefully you found something tangible you can take back to your employers. I think the biggest takeaway is there are changes. Some of them are significant. They're not going to affect every contractor, every person on the call every time. As always, we'd always suggest that you reach out to your counsel if you have questions about how the changes are impacting you. But I think it's important to know that there were changes, and the changes are important to a lot of people, and to at least acknowledge that, hey, there are changes, do these affect us this time around would be great. So thanks for hanging on, everybody. If there's any questions, if you want to drop a line, I saw Holly had asked if the forms are executable forms. I believe the AIA documents have been updated online, and Judy had just asked a question about the presentation being emailed. Yes, the presentation is going to be available on NAWIC.org's member site. If anyone has a question, email me at the PDE@NAWIC.org, and I'm happy to provide that. Are they available now? Holly, let's see. Your question was, are the forms executable via AIA's document site? Yes, I believe if you have access to AIA, they have updated their forms. So hopefully that'll help you. Holly, if you have a further question on that, just drop me a line and I'm happy to help answer that question. But our topics for 2018 are up hopefully on the screen: work-life integration, sexual harassment, and risk management 101. If I can do anything for anybody, don't hesitate to let me know. And thanks again for attending. I do also want to thank Dave Fine for taking his time to speak to us about this. I know it was a dense conversation, but I think you had some great information. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.